Let's take a look at an incredibly useful feature on the Quantum 2, and that is the headphone source switching that we have available. So you'll notice over here, we have this colored icon. It's currently in a yellowish orange color, and if I click this, it toggles to a red color. Now, in addition to changing color, we can also see that this out 3/4 has just become illuminated. Let's toggle this back, and you can see that this is grayed out. So essentially what this means is that we have two separate discrete headphone sources that we can monitor through on the built-in headphone output of the Quantum 2. So let's talk about the use cases for this and where it might come in handy. So the way I see it is that it is pretty much the same use case, but there's two different scenarios. So one, for example, would be, let's say that we're working in Studio One, and in addition to being the producer and engineer, we're also functioning as a recording artist, which is a pretty common scenario that most people would find themselves in, being that you are in charge of engineering as well as performing. Now, something that's pretty common when recording is that while people are recording, they may ask for an alternate mix. Now, this is why we have tools such as headphone amplifiers and the Q-Mix setup that we have in Studio One. So for example, let's take a look at our outputs over here. I have a couple different outputs that I've mapped out. I've got my main outs, and I have my line out 3 and 4, and then I have my HP. Now this would be if I wanted to set up a headphone direct source. But one thing worth mentioning over here on the Quantum 2 is that our A source on our headphones is always hardwired to the main outs. So whereas with the full-size Quantum, we can designate the routing of both Headphone 1 and Headphone 2, in the Quantum 2, the headphone A source is always hardwired to the main outs, and the headphone B source we can designate as an alternate. So let's go ahead and talk about how we would make sense of that. Well, first off, one thing that I can do over here with my line outs 3 and 4 is I can change this to HP4, because I currently have an HP4 hooked up to analog 3/4 out on my Quantum 2. This will make things a little bit easier. Let's go ahead and click apply. And the next thing I want to do is let's enable HP4 as a Q-Mix. So we'll click apply and OK. Now, if I expand this track over here, notice I have this Q-Mix option set up where I have HP4. Now, this simply means that we're sending out a Q-Mix output to my HP4. So now we have the option to essentially listen to two completely different mixes. And the great thing about this is that we can do it directly from within the software, just by clicking over here. And in addition to that, we can also do it from universal control by clicking over here. Now you'll notice if I do it on the hardware, if I go ahead and toggle this, it's also going to follow. So we have three different areas that we can alternate or toggle our headphone source. Now let's go back to talking about the use cases. So one thing that you might be able to do is if we wanted to, for instance, set up a different mix when we're recording versus when we're tracking, this would now become possible, and it's very easy to do simply by toggling this A-B switch. So let's go ahead and view our outputs. So for example, I want to set the click on my HP4, and let's go ahead and move this, but I only want this to be happening when we're recording. Now, when I'm playing back or listening to everything in terms of my whole track, now keep in mind I only have one track here for the sake of demonstration, I don't want to listen to the click. I'm going to disable the click from my main outs. So now what I can do is while I'm in record mode, we'll just go ahead and we're going to use out 3/4. And line out 3/4 we've set up as a Q-Mix, which means that we're sending out this track. And of course, keep in mind when these are locked that these will follow. But if I wanted to set up an alternate mix where, for example, I want this to be a little bit louder, and in addition to that, I want to have a click, I can go ahead and do that. Now I will be listening to this output as long as my A-B switch is red, indicating I'm listening to B. We can also see that the out 3/4 has become illuminated. Now I can choose any one of these sources, but keep in mind that we have to make sure that we have the sources routed in Studio One in the I/O setup and ultimately set up as a Q-Mix in order to really take advantage of this workflow. Now I could go ahead and I could do a record pass listening to the click with my levels a little bit louder, but then when I want to listen back to my performance, I can simply click this switch over here, and now very easily I'm listening to my mix that's coming out of the main outs, which is my fader at unity gain, and obviously no click. I can toggle back and forth between them. So that's the first use case that I see, is that if you're recording yourself and you need to have two completely different mixes. Now the next use case is very similar, but instead of talking about referring to recording yourself, let's talk about setting up alternate mixes for an artist that you're working with. Now, like I mentioned, it's pretty common to have different headphone mixes while you're tracking. But one thing that's kind of tough to do, if you don't have a way to quickly patch in and listen to the alternate mix that the artist is requesting, then it's pretty hard to set it up. Now keep in mind, if you work in a live room and a control room setup, that it might also be the case that the headphone amplifier is in the live room beside the artist. So unless you were to literally go into the live room and plug into that headphone amp and use a Studio One remote of some sort to adjust things, it'd be next to impossible to do this. But with this A/B toggle button, we can do this quite simply. So taking the exact same track in the exact same example, if I'm in the control room and I'm listening to source A, which as we've mentioned before is hardwired to the main outs that are coming out of the Quantum 2, and I need to make some adjustments to the mix in terms of fine-tuning some levels, maybe setting some different pans, setting a click level. Very easy for me to click this A/B toggle and just make sure that my headphone source is set to the exact same output that I'm using as a cue mix for my artist. So very, very useful, very practical feature, and it definitely comes in handy.